It was Christmas Eve, and I was spending the holiday alone for the first time in years. My family had planned a vacation, but work commitments kept me back. The quietness of my apartment, usually a comfort, felt unnervingly loud that night. Snow was falling heavily outside, blanketing the street in a soft white glow under the streetlights. It should have felt peaceful, but something about the night felt off. I decided to make myself some hot cocoa and settle by the window. Watching the snow had always calmed me. My apartment was on the second floor, with a perfect view of the small street below. The world outside looked deserted, not a single person braving the cold weather. I stared out at the snow, lost in thought, when I noticed something that made me freeze. Footprints. They appeared out of nowhere in the snow, starting right in the middle of the street and leading directly toward my building. I hadn't seen anyone walking, and the snow was still falling steadily, yet the footprints remained fresh and defined. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had walked by earlier, and I just hadn't noticed. Still, my heart raced as I stared at the strange trail. The footprints stopped abruptly at the sidewalk, directly in front of my apartment building. Whoever it was, they hadn't moved from that spot. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to shake the feeling of unease. It was just footprints, I told myself, nothing more. To distract myself, I turned on the TV and sank into the couch, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that I was being watched. An hour passed, and the tension in my chest began to ease. Maybe I'd overreacted. Then came the knock. It was soft, barely audible, but it sent chills through me. I glanced at the door, expecting to see a shadow through the peephole, but it was empty. Another knock followed, louder this time. My heart pounded as I stood and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The knocks grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned to face the living room. Through the sheer curtain, I could see the faint outline of a figure standing on the fire escape. I didn't dare move. I didn't breathe. Whoever it was, they stood completely still, their face obscured by the curtain. My phone was on the coffee table, but to reach it, I'd have to move closer to the window. The figure pressed a hand against the glass, leaving behind a frosty imprint. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. I whispered to the operator about the intruder, never taking my eyes off the window. The figure remained motionless, their breath fogging up the glass. Within minutes, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over me as the figure turned and climbed down the fire escape. I rushed to the window, expecting to see them fleeing into the night, but they were gone. No footprints in the snow. Nothing. The police found no sign of forced entry and no tracks outside. They assured me it was likely a prank, but their reassurances did little to calm me. That night, I barely slept, and when morning came, I left to spend the rest of the holiday with my family. Weeks later, I found a single handprint on the outside of my window, perfectly preserved in the frost. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. It was a season of warmth, family, and memories. But last year, something happened that changed how I feel about the holidays forever. My grandmother had passed away a few months before Christmas. She was the cornerstone of our family, a kind and loving woman who brought us all together. As my mother and I went through her belongings, we found a box of her old Christmas ornaments. Each one carried its own story, tiny trinkets collected over decades. My mother decided to distribute them among the family as keepsakes. She handed me one in particular, a delicate glass ball painted with a snowy village scene. This was one of her favorites, my mother said, her voice heavy with emotion. I accepted it with a mix of sadness and gratitude. It felt like a part of my grandmother would still be with me. That evening, as I set up my Christmas tree, I carefully hung the ornament in the center, right where it would catch the glow of the lights. It shimmered more brightly than the others, almost as if it had a light of its own. As I stepped back to admire the tree, I felt a strange chill. The room wasn't cold. It was the kind of chill that crept up your spine and made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I shook it off, attributing it to my emotions and the bittersweet memory of my grandmother. That night, as I lay in bed, I was woken by a faint sound. It was so soft at first that I thought I might have imagined it, a tinkling, almost like glass tapping against glass. I strained my ears and heard it again, louder this time. My heart started to race. I got up and walked into the living room. The tree stood exactly as I had left it, its lights casting a warm glow across the room. I scanned the branches, expecting to find one of the ornaments had fallen, but everything was in place. The sound stopped as I stood there, my breath fogging in the air. I turned to go back to bed, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something that made me freeze. The glass ornament, the one from my grandmother, was spinning slowly on its branch. There was no draft, no movement in the room, yet the ornament rotated steadily, as if an invisible hand was turning it. My legs felt rooted to the floor. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me. I stepped closer, my heart pounding with every step. The closer I got, the more intense the sensation of being watched became. The ornament stopped spinning as I reached out to touch it. For a moment, everything felt normal, just a fragile glass ball reflecting the glow of the lights. But as my fingers brushed the glass, I saw something inside. It was faint, barely visible, a shadow moving across the tiny painted village inside the ornament. It darted behind the miniature houses, too fast for me to focus on. My stomach churned. I yanked my hand back and stumbled away from the tree. I didn't know what I had just seen, but every instinct screamed at me to leave the room. I turned off the lights and went back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child afraid of the dark. The next morning, I woke to find the ornament lying on the floor, shattered into countless pieces. I hadn't heard it fall, and the hook it had been hanging on was still secure. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick up the shards, careful not to cut myself. That's when I saw it, something I still can't explain. Amid the broken glass was a tiny blackened figure. It looked like a doll, no bigger than a fingernail, but its features were grotesque and distorted, as if it had been burned. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare up at me. I threw the pieces away immediately, including the strange little figure. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind caused by grief and exhaustion. But that night, the sound returned. It started as a faint tapping, just like before, coming from the corner of the room where the tree stood. I turned on every light in the house and cautiously approached the tree. Nothing was out of place, but the tapping persisted, louder now. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't coming from the tree itself. It was coming from the trash can where I had thrown the shattered ornament. My throat went dry. Slowly, I opened the lid. Inside, Among the crumpled paper and broken glass, the tiny black figure sat upright, facing me. Its burnt features seemed more defined now, as if it had come to life. I slammed the lid shut and dragged the trash bag outside, tossing it into the bin by the curb. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tapping sound in my head. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the living room floor, right where the ornament had been hanging, was a small, sooty footprint. I've since gotten rid of every ornament from that year, refusing to use them again. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint tinkling sound of glass tapping against glass. And when I do, I wonder if whatever was inside that ornament ever really left. Last Christmas Eve, I stayed at my parents' house for the first time in years. Life had become hectic after I moved to the city, and the holiday season often slipped away in a blur of deadlines and social obligations. But that year, I decided to take a break, to return to the quiet suburb where I grew up. I wanted to reconnect with my family, with the warmth of old traditions. The evening started simply enough. My parents and I decorated the tree, its lights casting a soft, comforting glow across the living room. Snow had started to fall lightly outside, blanketing the neighborhood in a hushed, white silence. After dinner, we settled in to watch a Christmas movie, the kind you've seen so many times it feels like an old friend. It was just past 9 p.m. when we heard the singing. At first, it was faint, a distant hum carried by the wind. My mom smiled, her face lighting up. "Carolers," she said, standing up to peek through the window. I followed her, curious. Growing up, carolers were a regular occurrence in our neighborhood, groups of friends or church members bringing a bit of holiday cheer door to door. But it had been years since I'd seen or heard them. Through the frosted glass, I could see them standing at the end of our driveway. Their silhouettes were dark against the snow, but I could make out their matching cloaks, long and flowing, the kind you'd expect in a Dickensian Christmas scene. "They're dressed for the part," my dad said with a chuckle, joining us by the window. Their singing was beautiful, hauntingly so. The melody was unfamiliar, a slow, somber tune that sent a chill down my spine despite its elegance. It wasn't the typical jolly repertoire of carols. There were no "Deck the Halls" or "Jingle Bells." This was something else entirely, something old and mournful. "They're good," my mom said, though her voice had an edge of uncertainty. The three of us stood there, watching. The carolers didn't approach the house. They just stood at the end of the driveway, singing. Their cloaks billowed slightly in the breeze, but their faces remained obscured by the shadows. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but it was as if the snow and the dark conspired to keep them veiled. "Should we invite them closer?" my mom asked. Before any of us could answer, the singing stopped. The sudden silence was jarring, almost deafening. The carolers didn't move. They stood there, statuesque, their heads slightly tilted as if they were watching us. A strange unease settled over me. "Maybe they're waiting for us to go out there," I said, though the thought of stepping outside filled me with inexplicable dread. "Let's give them a few minutes," my dad suggested. "Maybe they'll come to the door." But they didn't. After a moment, they turned in unison and walked away, disappearing into the snow. Their footsteps made no sound, as if the snow swallowed their presence entirely. We returned to the couch, uneasy, but willing to brush it off. Maybe it was a local group we didn't know, trying something different, but the memory of that strange, mournful song lingered with me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint creaking of old wood in the winter chill. I stood by the window in my childhood room, looking out at the snowy street. The faint imprint of footsteps marked the spot where the carolers had stood, but the trail ended abruptly, as if they had simply vanished. I was about to draw the curtains when I saw movement. Across the street, standing perfectly still on the neighbor's lawn, were the carolers. I froze. They weren't singing. They were just standing there, facing our house. Even in the dark, I could tell they were looking directly at my window. I turned off the light, my heart hammering in my chest. From the shadows, I watched them, hoping they'd leave. But they didn't move. They stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. And then, one by one, they turned their heads to look at different parts of the house. I crept back to bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child afraid of monsters. I told myself I was imagining things, that my tired mind was playing tricks on me. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking to the sound of music, the same mournful melody, now louder and closer. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. I crept out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. The music grew louder as I approached the living room. My parents' bedroom door was closed, their light off. The Christmas tree lights twinkled softly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And standing in front of the tree were the carolers. Their cloaks were even darker in the faint light, their faces still hidden. They didn't turn to look at me, but I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating. The music wasn't coming from them. It seemed to fill the air, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. I backed away, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to wake my parents, but I couldn't move. One of the carolers slowly raised an arm, pointing at the tree. I followed their gesture, my eyes landing on an ornament near the top. It was a glass ball, one I didn't recognize, glowing faintly. Inside it, I thought I saw movement, tiny figures that seemed to mimic the carolers, standing in a miniature snowy landscape. I turned and ran to my parents' room, banging on the door until they woke. By the time they followed me back to the living room, the carolers were gone. But the ornament was still there, its faint glow flickering like a dying ember. My dad removed it from the tree the next day and threw it away, though I later found it back in its original spot. I don't know who or what the carolers were. They haven't returned, but every Christmas Eve since, I hear faint singing outside my window. And each year, the melody grows louder,